The 2-year-old baby keeps pointing at his father's coffin. What happens next is shocking. Hello. Everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch. The St. Michael's Church was shrouded in an atmosphere of mourning. The church bells tolled in long, solemn peals, blending with the muffled sobs of the grieving, creating a chilling, heart-wrenching feeling. Clara stood silently beside her husband's coffin, holding little Elira tightly in her arms. The 2-year-old struggled against her mother's grasp, her small face flushed red from crying too much. Clara bent down to soothe her, but Elira refused to be calmed. The child's innocent eyes were fixed on the wooden coffin, where Samuel lay motionless. Papa, Elira sobbed, her tiny fingers trembling as she pointed toward the coffin. Clara swallowed hard, her hands gripping the black mourning veil. She wanted to cry, but her tears were stuck in her throat. Samuel's sudden death still felt like a nightmare. Just yesterday he had kissed her before leaving the house, and now all that remained was a cold, lifeless body. "Papa is trapped!" Elira's childish voice echoed through the funeral, causing everyone to fall silent. The 2-year-old, in her mother's arms, suddenly uttered words that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone in the church. Clara froze, holding her trembling daughter. Elira, her eyes red from crying, continued to point at the dark wooden coffin where her father lay. Those words seemed to tear through the heavy atmosphere in St. Michael's Cathedral. A few guests began to whisper. Some made the sign of the cross, trying to ignore the child's words as if they were just a figment of her imagination. But Elira didn't stop. She continued, her voice choking. "Papa is scared. He's calling me." Clara looked around nervously. The villagers, people who had lived alongside her family for many years, began to feel uneasy. Samuel, the kind and healthy man who had just yesterday been joyfully holding their child, now lay motionless in the coffin, dead from sudden death. Everything had happened too quickly, and now their daughter insisted that he was still alive. At the back of the church, an elderly woman stood up. Madame Rose, who lived near Clara's house, took a few steps forward. She whispered softly to herself, "The child can see what adults cannot." Her words sent a chill down the spines of those nearby. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the stained glass windows, causing the candles in the church to flicker. The flames wavered, and shadowy figures danced on the walls. Someone in the row of seats in front heard a faint scraping sound coming from the wooden door, as if someone was lightly scratching the old wood. Clara bent down to face her daughter. "Elira, where is Papa trapped?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. The child didn't answer, only turned back and pointed directly at the space behind the coffin, the place where light couldn't reach. Clara followed her gaze, but then she jumped when a nearby candle suddenly went out. No one had touched it, but the flame disappeared as though someone had blown it out. The pastor stepped forward and spoke gently. "Maybe the child doesn't understand what death is. Sometimes children imagine things when they lose someone." "No," Clara whispered. The look in her eyes, it's not imagination. It's like she's truly seeing something. Elira slipped from her mother's arms and tottered closer to the coffin. She placed her tiny hand on the dark corner behind it, where she had pointed from the beginning. "Papa is here," she said softly, but clearly. Everyone who witnessed it froze. No one dared to laugh. No one spoke. The autumn morning cast a cold gray hue over the quiet cemetery, the thumping of hearts in everyone's chest, and a cold chill spreading through the church remained. Something unsaid, a truth still hidden, and only Elira was the first to sense it. As the darkness of the funeral ceremony still lingered over the church, the large wooden door at the back slowly creaked open. A figure entered, tall and slender, impeccably dressed in a black suit, his eyes devoid of sorrow and filled with calculation. It was Henry, Samuel's cousin, known in the village as a distant relative who rarely appeared at family gatherings, but always showed up at important events. His presence, in that moment, did not bring comfort, but rather a strange breeze that made the atmosphere even heavier. Henry walked straight toward Clara, his face unusually calm. No tears, no sincere words of condolence. He bowed his head slightly and gently placed his hand on Clara's shoulder, speaking in a low voice, but with clear implication. I know this is a difficult time, but Samuel left quite a bit of debt. Perhaps it's time you think about selling the house. Clara was stunned. Her heart was still bleeding, yet Henry was already bringing up matters of property. She hadn't buried her husband, hadn't yet said her final goodbye. And here was this relative talking about the house and debts. A cold chill ran down her spine. Elira, the 2-year-old girl, clung to her mother's hand, her eyes still fixed on the coffin as if she sensed that something was wrong. I think we can talk about this later, Clara whispered, trying to stay calm. But Henry seemed indifferent. He glanced quickly at the funeral attendees, then bent down near Elira, offering a forced fake smile. Little one, I heard you say your father is still alive, right? Henry said with a half-joking, half-sarcastic tone. Children often have wild imaginations, don't they? Elira stepped back, hiding in her mother's arms. She didn't answer, only clung tightly to Clara. Henry's gaze turned slightly annoyed. He stood up straight and turned to the crowd, as if to assert his previous statement. We all know Samuel has passed. Let's not let a child disturb everyone's peace of mind. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. Henry's words weren't merely denying the pain. They felt like an attempt to extinguish something, as though Elira had touched upon something he didn't want anyone to mention. She recalled her daughter's repeated words. Papa is trapped. Papa is scared. She remembered Elira's frightened eyes, her tiny hand pointing to the dark corner behind the coffin. Henry leaned down again, this time whispering softly enough only the two of them could hear. You should keep her quiet. Kids can cause confusion. Everything will be fine if you know your place. The words struck Clara like a cold blade to the chest. Her eyes widened as she stared at Henry. She didn't speak, but her arms tightened around Elira, an instinctual reaction to protect her. A mother's intuition rang out in alarm. Samuel hadn't even been buried yet, but Henry was already calculating debts, quickly dismissing everything her daughter had said and hastily demanding silence. A few attendees observed from afar, whispering among themselves. They couldn't hear everything, but Henry's attitude unsettled them. The lack of emotion, the unusual urgency, and the way he tried to control the conversation, all of it aroused suspicion. Clara bent down and kissed Elira's forehead gently. In her heart, the unease had turned into something tangible. Something wasn't right. Henry knew it and was trying to cover it up. And now Clara was starting to feel it too. Something darker than the funeral's shadow was quietly spreading throughout the church, waiting to be uncovered. In the heavy, gloomy space of the cathedral, where the candles flickered weakly on the altar, Elira spoke again, her voice as though coming from another world. Papa is calling me. He's scared. The sound was as light as the wind, but cut deep like a knife. The people present in the church raised their heads, their eyes shifting from pity to skepticism, and then to worry. Elira continued to stare intently at the coffin, her eyes unblinking. Clara tightened her grip on her daughter, her heart filled with unease. Elira's words no longer seemed like mere expressions of grief or longing, but a warning from the invisible world. The atmosphere in the church grew suffocating, the silence so thick that one could hear the choked sobs from a hidden corner. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed. Thud. A dull, short noise, as though something inside the coffin had struck the wooden lid. Everyone went silent. Some people turned to look at each other, panic in their eyes. Clara stood frozen. She couldn't believe her ears. Elira turned to look at her mother, nodding slightly, as if to confirm that what she had heard was real. The sound came again, this time clearer, longer. Thud, thud. No one dared to move. Their eyes were fixed on the coffin, where Samuel lay, supposedly dead. The church door opened again. A man hurriedly stepped in, his coat still unbuttoned. It was Matthew, Samuel's best friend, who had been away on a business trip and had just returned. His face was filled with panic, his eyes darting around as they adjusted to the light in the church, searching for Clara. He rushed towards her, grabbing her shoulder, whispering almost loudly, "I have something important to tell you. Samuel. He once told me he was afraid Henry would do something to force the sale of the house. He said if anything happened, we should investigate Henry first." Clara turned to look at Henry, standing at the back of the row of seats, his face stiff, his eyes dark. The atmosphere in the church froze. Matthew's words were like a knife tearing through the veil of mourning, exposing a dark reality that everyone had vaguely sensed but had not dared to speak. Elira pulled Clara's hand, pointing at the coffin, her voice faint. "Mama, he's calling again." No one spoke. Even the pastor didn't step forward. Everyone just stood still, like statues. Some older people repeatedly made the sign of the cross, muttering prayers under their breath. The room seemed to freeze in an unnamed fear. Clara, with tears in her eyes, sank to her knees, holding Elira close, her heart pounding. Matthew did not hesitate any longer. He stepped towards the coffin, placing his hand on the wooden lid. "We can't pretend we didn't hear it. If there's even a 1% chance that he's still alive, we have to do something." Henry quickly moved forward, blocking him. "Are you crazy? This is a funeral. Don't embarrass the whole family." But his voice wasn't as strong anymore. His hand betrayed his trembling. "Then why are you so scared?" Matthew looked straight into Henry's eyes, not backing down. "If there's nothing to hide, then why oppose the inspection?" Below, the villagers began to murmur. Suspicious glances were directed at Henry. Clara, in that moment, seemed to awaken. She stepped forward, her gaze resolute. "I am his wife. I want to open the coffin, right now." The pastor stepped forward, placing his hand on his chest, his voice full of emotion. "If you loved him the most, then you have the right." Henry stood motionless, his face pale. Sweat began to soak through his dark suit. Clara, despite her fear, did not falter. A part of her, the sacred intuition of a wife, a mother, told her that the truth lay beneath that wooden lid, waiting to be freed from the shadows. In that moment of silence, the knocking came again, louder than ever. Thud, thud, thud. And that was when everyone's gaze converged. Something was wrong. Samuel might still be alive. A terrifying truth was about to be revealed. And the innocent warning from a 2-year-old child turned out to be the saving bell for a father everyone thought was forever gone. The room filled with stifled sobs. An elderly woman standing near the door began to cry. A young man clenched his hands tightly, his eyes full of doubt. Clara looked around, seeing the quiet change in every face, the beating heart swaying with fear and hope intertwined. Elira, still in her mother's arms, whispered once more, "He's not gone. He's waiting." A waiting that suddenly became urgent. She couldn't let this end like this. She couldn't let the silence bury the faint cry for help slowly fading behind the cold wood. Clara took a deep breath. Her footsteps moved closer to the coffin, each step echoing from a heart pained but strong. The villagers parted, making a path as if silently acknowledging the courage and pain of the woman confronting something no one dared believe. She stood before the coffin, looking down at the wooden lid adorned with white flowers, taking another deep breath. "Samuel," she called softly, not to verify, but like a final word, or the beginning of something coming back to life. The large door of the church suddenly opened once again, accompanied by the sound of hurried footsteps. A man in a white lab coat, his face blank, rushed in with a file in hand. It was Dr. Esteban, the forensic doctor responsible for examining and confirming Samuel's death. He was panting, his eyes on the verge of tears. Everyone present turned to look, and the atmosphere in the church immediately became tense. "Wait a moment," Esteban called out, his voice trembling but firm. "Stop everything. I have something very serious to say." He walked to the center of the aisle, raised the file high in front of everyone, and opened it. "I just received a notification from the health department. Samuel's death certificate is fake. No doctor was assigned to the scene. There is no autopsy report. There is no legal confirmation of the cause of death. The church fell into stunned silence. Whispers started spreading everywhere. A few people couldn't hold back and cried out. Henry, who was standing near the exit, took a step back. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his face as white as if all the blood had drained from it. Clara shook her head repeatedly, tears flowing uncontrollably. No, it can't be. I thought he was just sleeping, but everyone said I was crazy. I wanted to check, but they wouldn't let me. Esteban looked at Clara, his eyes full of regret. I'm sorry. I truly didn't know about this. I thought someone else was handling the confirmation, but when I reviewed the records, no one in the system had done that. A light tapping came from inside the coffin. Each thud sounded like a cry for help from the depths. No one doubted anything anymore. A few elderly people quietly made the sign of the cross, murmuring prayers as if standing before a terrifying miracle. At that moment, Henry staggered. He suddenly slumped onto the last row of seats, clutching his head with his hands, his body shaking violently. A few villagers stepped closer, but he looked up and shouted, I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to warn him. I just wanted to scare him. All eyes turned toward Henry. Matthew angrily charged forward, but Clara held him back. Let him speak. Clara's voice was hoarse. Henry gulped, his breathing rapid, and then began to confess. I put a kind of drug into Samuel's tea. It's a mild respiratory suppressant. I thought he'd just pass out, then wake up, and realize that if he didn't sell the house, he'd lose everything. I didn't expect him to have a severe allergic reaction. I panicked. I thought he was dead. A cry erupted from the front row. The elderly woman sitting there broke into sobs. The entire church was filled with a mix of shock and anger. The sound of sobs echoed from the corners, like a wave of sorrow spreading throughout. Henry bent over, speaking as if pleading. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to stop him from keeping the house. It's worth millions. I'm drowning in debt. If he didn't sell, I'd lose everything. Clara moved closer to him, her eyes burning. And you think killing my husband is the way to solve this? Her voice rang out, filled with pain. You falsified documents, organized a rushed funeral, wouldn't let me touch his body, wouldn't let me say my final goodbye. All of this, just to bury the truth? Henry lowered his head, unable to say another word. All eyes now were like cold daggers pointed straight at him. The atmosphere in the church seemed ready to explode. A few men standing nearby had begun to clench their fists, unable to contain their fury. Dr. Esteban stepped forward and gently said, We need to open the coffin immediately. We might still be in time. The pastor nodded and then motioned to two assistants. Everyone moved forward together. No one could stand still anymore. In that moment, the large candle on the altar suddenly flickered out. A cold breeze swept through, causing everyone to shiver. The coffin was slowly opened, and as the first light shone inside, the entire church held its breath. Clara tightly gripped Elira's hand, her legs almost buckling beneath her. Elira whispered, Papa, please wake up. Each piece of truth, each layer of lies, was collapsing before everyone's eyes, all because of the weak call of a child and the soft thud of someone buried alive. Samuel was still there, still warm, still not fully gone from this world. A sacred silence enveloped the space. And then, a small groan echoed from within the coffin. Samuel, though weak, was still fighting to survive. Everyone burst into tears. Clara rushed forward, grabbing his cold hand, her eyes filled with tears. Hey, it's me. Elira is here. We're here. Don't go. A funeral had turned into a resurrection miracle, and a seemingly innocent word from a 2-year-old child was the key to breaking the darkness of the crime. A faint groan echoed from the coffin, tearing through the tense atmosphere in the church. All eyes immediately turned towards it. No one doubted anymore. No one could remain silent. Clara stood up, her hands trembling but her gaze filled with determination. She turned to look at the pastor, then at Dr. Esteban and Matthew. I want to open the coffin, she said, enunciating each word clearly. Right now, Henry leapt up from his seat, his voice hoarse with anger and fear. No, you are not allowed. Clara didn't turn back. You have no rights anymore. Henry, enough. The pastor stepped forward, nodding gently. If you are the wife of the deceased and have a legitimate reason, the church will not prevent it. He gestured for the two assistants to prepare the tools to open the lid. Matthew and James, Samuel's younger brother, walked up to Clara. Both of them gripped each other's hands tightly, their gazes resolute. Matthew said, "We will do this together, whatever happens. We cannot let him be buried alive." Henry stepped back, his face pale, sweat pouring down like a shower. He stammered, "You will regret it. If you open it, there will be no turning back." "We would rather face the truth than live in lies," Clara replied coldly. When the last nails were removed, the entire church fell silent. A cold breath from inside wafted out. The smell of damp wood and the stifling air made it hard to breathe. Clara took a deep breath, then, with Matthew and James, slowly lifted the lid of the coffin. Light poured inside. A gasp was heard. Samuel lay there, his face pale, but his chest still faintly rising and falling. His dry lips, his chest weakly struggling with each breath. His hand moved slightly, as if trying to reach out from the darkness that someone else had forced him into. "My God." James stepped back, his hands on his head. He's still alive." Clara collapsed beside the coffin. "Samuel!" she cried out, her voice breaking with tears. Elira ran over as well, her small hand reaching out to gently touch her father's hand. The room seemed frozen, everything so still that one could hear the fragile breaths of Samuel. Samuel slowly opened his eyes. A tear rolled down his cheek. He moaned wordlessly, but his lips moved. "Clara, Elira." His voice was hoarse, like a soft breeze whispering through the emotional air. The church erupted. People began to cry. Some knelt to pray. Some couldn't believe their eyes. A man who had been declared dead, now revived, like a miracle. Not because of luck, but because of love, persistence, and the unwavering faith of those who loved him. Henry screamed, trying to run away, but a man standing nearby immediately blocked his path. "It's not that easy, Henry." The voice was firm, decisive, like it represented the whole village, the people who had been betrayed by their own kin. The police had been called. Within minutes, 2 officers entered. Clara pointed at Henry. "That's the one who poisoned my husband, the one who forged documents, the one who organized the funeral to bury someone alive." Her voice didn't tremble, but was filled with the strength of justice. Henry struggled, shouting, "I didn't try to kill him. I just wanted to scare him. I didn't know he was so allergic." His desperate words echoed in the villagers' anger. No one believed him anymore. No one defended him. One officer quietly handcuffed him. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say will be used against you in court." The silence that followed was as heavy as a stone pressing on everyone present, but at the same time, it was a cleansing, the beginning of revival. The villagers stood up and clapped, not in joy, but because justice had finally spoken. Clara hugged Elira, then turned to look at Samuel. Dr. Esteban had begun performing resuscitation on the spot, and medical staff had arrived. One of them whispered, "If it had been just a few more hours, it would have been too late." People stepped back, clearing the way. Elira placed a light kiss on her father's forehead. "Papa, don't be afraid anymore. We're here now." Elira's words echoed like a miracle, soothing the pain that had filled Samuel's heart. A funeral had turned into life. A 2-year-old child had saved her father from death. And a mother, with her heart, with sacred intuition, had dared to face the darkness to bring the truth back to the light. The church rang with the sound of bells, not funeral bells, but the bells of life, of hope, and of awakening. The rays of light filtering through the stained glass shone on the faces of Samuel, Clara, and Elira as proof of one sacred truth. Love never gives up. The truth never sleeps. And light, sooner or later, will break through the darkness. The autumn morning cast a cold gray hue over the quiet cemetery. Cassian Villaro walked slowly between rows of leafless trees, holding in his hand the bouquet of white flowers he brought every year. Today marked the 5th anniversary of Evelyn's death, the only woman who had ever truly moved his heart. Since she passed, Cass then, Seren, not Donovan, Dup. 3 days after the incident at the church, Clara sat motionless on the hard plastic chair in the hallway of the central hospital. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling cast a pale glow, making everything feel even colder. Elira slept on her mother's lap, her soft brown hair hanging down her shoulder, and Clara still had the faint bruise from holding on to Samuel when he was brought into the emergency room. The door to the intensive care unit opened slightly. A doctor stepped out, removed his mask, his face weary but smiling. "He's awake. You and the baby can come in." Clara jumped up, tears flowing before she could wipe them away. She picked up Elira and quickly walked to the room where her husband lay. Samuel, the man she had once thought was lost to her forever, was lying there, his skin still pale, but his eyes were open and gleaming with faint light. Elira looked up, her eyes wide. "Papa?" Her voice trembled. Samuel slowly turned his head, trying to move his fingers. When his eyes met his daughter's, a tear rolled down his cheek. "Elira, Clara," he whispered. His voice choked as if every thread of his heart was being touched by Clara's. Clara placed Elira on the bed and then took Samuel's hand, pressing it to her cheek. "We're here. I'm here, Samuel. I will never leave you." Samuel shuddered. "I thought I was dead, but I heard everything." His lips trembled. "I heard you crying. I heard Elira calling Papa. I heard Henry lying." Clara embraced him, her whole body shaking. "You're back. You're alive. We're still a family." Samuel closed his eyes, more tears flowing down his face. "I thought I would never see you and our daughter again. In that darkness, only Elira's voice kept me alive. Every time she called, my heart beat another beat." Elira hugged her father's neck, pressing her face into his shoulder. "Papa, don't be afraid anymore. I'm here now." The atmosphere in the hospital room seemed to freeze in that sacred moment. The doctors and nurses stood quietly outside, not wanting to interrupt this tear-filled reunion. A family that once thought they had lost everything, now reunited, not by any miracle, but by the enduring love and the strong intuition of a mother who would not accept deception. Clara gently stroked Samuel's hair. "It's all over. Henry's been arrested. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Samuel exhaled slowly. "I heard everything. Even when they closed the coffin. Even when Elira screamed. And when you shouted, demanding they open it. I just wanted someone to believe I was still here. And you heard my voice, even when the whole world thought I was dead." "You didn't hear with your ears," Clara whispered. "You heard with your heart." Those moments, every word, every gesture, carried the weight of loss, of hope, of pain, and of rebirth. Elira curled up next to her father, falling asleep peacefully for the first time in days of turmoil. Clara sat beside them, never taking her eyes off her husband. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but now she had the most precious thing again: family. Outside the window, the morning sunlight began to shine, casting its light on the bed where Samuel lay. It was not just the light of a new day, but the light of life, of love, and of a truth that could not be buried. That morning, the courthouse was the center of the entire small town. The cold winter air filled the streets, covering everything with a thin layer of fog. All the roads leading to the courthouse were packed with people. Villagers from every corner gathered, waiting for an important event. This was not just an ordinary trial, but a day that would decide the fate of the man who had taken Samuel's life, causing his family to live in suffering and despair for months. Today, justice would be served, and the truth would be revealed. The courthouse, an old building with faded brick walls, had witnessed countless ups and downs in the town's history. Today, it became the battleground between truth and lies. Clara sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving Henry. the man she had once considered family. She had placed all her trust in him. But now, all that was left was betrayal. She looked at Henry, a man now facing justice. And within her, there was no more resentment, only a deep sadness. Elira sat beside her mother, holding her hand tightly. Though she didn't fully understand everything, the strange, intense emotions still surrounded her. The cold from outside seemed unable to melt the gloom inside her. While both mother and daughter felt heavy, Clara still managed to smile at Elira as a way to give her the strength she had been searching for all these days. Samuel sat beside the two women, but his mind was no longer here. He looked at Henry, where the man was preparing to face the punishment for his actions. Samuel felt no fear anymore. Facing justice, he was no longer afraid of anything. Every step Henry took, every lie he spoke, everything was being exposed. The pain his family had endured, the suffering Clara and Elira had gone through, would finally be repaid. As the judge read the verdict, the silence in the courtroom made the air thick with tension. Everyone waited for the moment when the truth would officially be confirmed. Henry Taylor, the defendant, is convicted of attempted murder, forgery, and burying a living person. His actions were not only crimes against family, but also violations of the right to life. He will face appropriate punishment. The silence enveloped the room, and then whispers rose from the corners. Everyone waited for the judge to announce the sentence. No one could predict what would happen. But after that moment of silence, the judge continued. With all the charges, defendant Henry Taylor is sentenced to 25 years in prison. The whispers faded, replaced by loud applause. It wasn't applause for revenge, but applause because justice had prevailed. The entire courtroom erupted. The villagers stood up, clapping, not because they rejoiced in Henry's punishment, but because they saw that justice had been served, and at last, the truth had been revealed. Samuel could no longer hold back his emotions. His eyes remained calm, but in his heart, there was a relief that words could not describe. He stood up, left his seat, and walked toward the center of the courtroom. All eyes turned to him. He didn't hesitate, walking with determination, even though deep down, he knew that every step was a step toward letting go of the hatred in his life. Samuel walked up to where Henry stood, head bowed, his hands cuffed. Samuel stopped, standing in front of the man who had caused so much harm to him and his family. In Samuel's eyes, there was no anger or hatred. Instead, his gaze was filled with serenity. He didn't want to carry any resentment anymore. He looked at Henry, not to punish him, but to say what he had to say, the thing that had weighed on his heart for so long. Samuel stood tall, his voice echoing throughout the courtroom. "You know, Henry," he said, his voice low but firm, "I don't hate you, but I despise your betrayal." These words struck Henry like a knife. He couldn't raise his head. A part of him felt suffocated, the guilt pressing down, impossible to escape. He knew that what he had done would never be forgiven. The people in the courtroom fell silent, no longer looking at him with pity, only with the silence of justice. Henry bowed his head, unable to speak. He no longer had the strength he once had. All that was left before him now was his downfall. He was no longer the victor, but the one being punished by the court. Everyone around him looked at him with disappointment, a sense that justice had been restored. He could no longer deny it, could no longer find any excuse to justify his actions. When the courtroom doors opened, Henry was led out in silence. No one in the courtroom seemed happy, but they applauded. Not for the punishment, but because justice had triumphed. A family that thought they had lost everything, now reunited, thanks to persistence, love, and forgiveness. Clara turned to look at Samuel, her eyes filled with gratitude. Samuel also turned to look at her, then at Elira. A gentle smile, a silent thank you from the depths of his heart. Nothing was more important at this moment. Nothing was worth more than the peace his family had found. Everything was over, and from now on, they would walk together on the road ahead, without the shadow of betrayal, without the pain of the days that had passed. When the courtroom doors closed, the space became quiet again, but it was the silence of victory. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a great triumph. The triumph of justice, of truth, and of love. The rays of light filtering through the stained glass illuminated the faces of Samuel, Clara, and Elira as proof of one sacred truth. Love never gives up. The truth never sleeps. And light, sooner or later, will break through the darkness. A month had passed since Henry was convicted, and after all the days of suffering, Samuel's family finally began to piece together the broken fragments from the long time of hardship. During that time, Clara and Elira had faced indescribable struggles together. The small town was gradually returning to its normal rhythm, but in their hearts, everything seemed to have changed. The peace they had been waiting for so long now came to them unexpectedly, like a gentle wave soothing the wounds in their hearts. That day, spring had arrived, with the soft golden sunlight covering everything around. The sun shone down on the earth, bringing with it the warmth of new life. Samuel, Clara, and Elira returned together to their old home. This was where they had once lived the happiest days, where they had built a home before everything collapsed. Now, the old house welcomed them back, as a reminder that no matter what happens, family remains the unwavering foundation. Samuel stepped out of the car and looked at the old house, his heart suddenly filled with emotion. This house had witnessed so many memories of his family. Happy smiles, joyful days, but also the place where so much pain had been endured. But today, as he returned to this place, Samuel felt life rising again, as if the sunlight not only illuminated the house but also lit up his heart. He no longer felt alone. Clara stepped out alongside Samuel, her gaze fixed on the old house. She sighed deeply and gently placed her hand on Samuel's shoulder. The feeling she had at that moment was indescribable. It was like a peace had covered her heart after all the storms they had been through. Clara tightly held Samuel's hand, and together they walked into the old house, passing through the door that had aged with time. The wooden door creaked, but to Clara, it was the sound of returning. It was the sound of a home that had once been built with love, and now that love was rekindled in their hearts. Elira ran ahead, her eyes lighting up when she saw the familiar space. Elira's laughter echoed through the quiet house, like a joyful cry of new hope. She ran to the front porch and then turned back to look at her mother and father. "We are a family. No one can be separated anymore." Elira's pure voice was a strong affirmation of unity, the unyielding strength of their family. Those words resonated in Clara and Samuel's hearts, like a declaration of the love and resilience they had experienced. Samuel and Clara moved toward Elira, and the three of them embraced tightly under the gentle sunlight. They stood there, on the porch, gazing out at the distant fields of lush green rice paddies, rising under the sun's light. Everything around seemed to awaken, like a reminder that no matter how life pushes us, family love will always be a firm foundation. They all knew that, no matter how many challenges lay ahead, they would always stand together as an unbreakable family. The sun shone, but not just the physical light we see in the sky. It was the light of life, of love, and of hope. As Samuel looked at Clara and then at Elira, he felt like everything around him became clear, and all the worries and fears of the past faded away. They had survived it all, overcome the worst storm life could bring, and now they would start again, a new journey. But this time, they wouldn't walk alone. They had each other. Elira grabbed her father's hand and pulled him toward the table on the porch. "Papa, what are we going to do today?" she asked. Samuel smiled, bent down to look at his daughter, and replied, "Today, we will do the things we love. We will start over, Elira, and nothing will ever tear us apart." His words were soft but full of determination. Samuel didn't need to say anything more. Everything that needed to be said was conveyed in his eyes, in his actions toward his family. With Elira's joyful laughter and Clara's warm smiles, The atmosphere around the old house gradually became vibrant. This house, though old, was now filled with the air of love. The doors opened again, footsteps echoed through the house, and everything seemed to find new life. Not because of material changes, but because of the change in the hearts of each person. Their family had gone through so many ups and downs, and now, when all the pain had passed, they could look back and say that, in the end, love had won. Samuel, Clara, and Elira stood under the sunlight, no longer fearful, no longer feeling lacking. They had each other, and that was all they needed. The painful days were behind them, and now, all that remained was faith in the future. The family was reunited. They no longer had anything to fear, and everything would return to the way it was. They would live this life together, every day, every moment, cherishing each other more than ever. Life is not always easy, but with love and resilience, they had found themselves again. And once more, this family would face every challenge in life together. This story ends with a profound lesson that faith, love, and resilience will always lead people to overcome every difficulty. Justice has prevailed, love has prevailed, and family will always be the place we return to, no matter how the world may change.